So my name is Jill Hesse, and I am the product manager for Clarity LIMS. And today in the webinar, we want to talk about what's upcoming in Clarity LIMS 5.0, as well as some things you want to consider when you're thinking about, should I upgrade to 5.0 or not? While we're having our chat, please feel free to ask questions. There's a chat panel in WebEx, and if you want to just chat me those questions, we'll stop several times throughout the presentation, and we'll talk specifically about any questions that you might have. So the first thing we want to do is go through, what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about Clarity LIMS 5.0, understanding what's upcoming, how these are going to affect your lab. We're going to talk about the boundaries of 5.0 and is 5.0 ready for you? So there are some features and functionalities related to the operations interface specifically that we'll talk about. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the 2017 roadmap items. So at the high level, Clarity LIMS 5.0 hits three major components. The first one is, this is our first release that's going to be completely without the operations interface. For some of you on the phone, you may have done a cheer. For others of you, you sort of scratched your head and thought, but I really like the operations interface. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. But what this means for you is greater system security, improvements around support, and flexibility that it provides us for new features and design functionalities as we move forward. One improvement of functionality and features that you'll see in this release is our improvement in configuration. Configuration is a big part of what everyone does when they're setting up a LIMS and ongoing, so we wanted to make configuration easier. So configuration now is in one central place, all located in the web interface. It includes things like new interactions for workflows and protocols and steps, being able to understand the relationships about how certain configured items relate to others, as well as increasing our support for touch and mobile components. The last component, which is sometimes not highlighted as part of a release because it doesn't appear to you on the screen anywhere, is this idea of preparing for the future. So many things that we did in the 5.0 release are about scalability and flexibility and setting the stage for upcoming components that we'll talk about in the 2017 roadmap items that will be important for you. So instead of going through a whole bunch of PowerPoints, what I want to do is I want to switch over and show you a little bit of the software live. So the first thing you'll notice is there are a couple of new UI-based things. No longer do you see that dark bar on the left-hand side with the navigation. All that navigation has been moved to the top of the screen. This sets the stage to allow us to make a more complete usage of the screen. And when we look at configuration, you'll see how we've done that. So the second component you'll notice here is that all of those things that you've grown to love about Clarity, dashboards, projects and samples, and your lab view are all still here, and in this release remain largely unchanged. So if you could create samples in a particular way in Clarity LIMS 4, you're going to have that same functionality in the 5.0 series. The same is true for things like how samples are processed, record details, as well as setting next steps. The big changes are around configuration. But before we move into configuration, the last component I'll show you is here on the right-hand side, we've collapsed the search bar. Again, the same search functionality that you're used to, it's just displayed in a little bit of a different way in the new version. But as I mentioned, most of the functionality and features in 5.0 are centered around configuration. And configuration is such a big part of LIMS, we knew that this was something we wanted to move to a central location so that you don't have to go back and forth between the operations interface, as well as improve this configuration so that we have more understanding about what's being configured, how it relates to your laboratory process, as well as just overall making it easier to onboard new people into your laboratory, as well as keep up with new things that might be happening if you're not in configuration on a day-to-day. So when we come to the Configuration tab, what we'll first see is this Workflows, Protocols, and Steps navigation. This navigation really forms the heart of interacting with how you build workflows, how you build protocols, as well as configuring each of those components that you're used to configuring on an individual step. One of the biggest powers of this navigation is the relationship that it shows you between the items. So for example, if I click on TruSeq RNA library prep, I'm immediately highlighting both the workflows it's involved in as well as the steps that it's made up of. So if I'm making a particular change to that protocol, I can quickly understand what other workflows will it affect. And it allows me to see that relationship of if I pick a particular step, for example, we'll use aggregate QC for DNA, that might be involved in multiple protocols. And if I make a change to that step, understanding that I'm going to be changing all of those protocols that step is used in. Since things like creating a workflow and creating a protocol seem relatively intuitive, you'll notice the plus sign, I wanted to focus on some of the new highlights and new features that configuration now has in relationship to what you're used to from the operations interface. So one of the first ones to highlight is around protocols. So if we take our TruSeq RNA library prep protocol, for example, the way I used to do this is I would build a protocol, I would go into each step inside that protocol, and I would set, okay, what's the appropriate next action? Do I want this to automatically start? Am I assigning the next steps by a script? And if there were 10 or 15 steps in this protocol, I'd have to click into each one of those steps. But in the new way we're doing configuration, we thought about it as things that apply to the protocol as a whole really should be configured at the protocol level. So once I've picked the RNA library prep, I can see here at the bottom of the screen a collection of things that are specific to the protocol. So now I can see here are my 4 steps of my protocol, and using this one configuration widget inside this protocol screen, I can easily set the next steps as well as decide what steps are automatically to start. So instead of having to click into each one of those components, I can quickly and easily say, at the end of mRNA purification, I want the option not only go to repair ends, but also to go to adenylate ends and ligate adapters. Additionally, a new feature on the protocol screen is the idea of copy. So this is something that has been popular amongst the feature request forum, and so you guys were really interested in this, so we wanted to bring copy to you as a function. So this copy functionality is going to allow me to make a copy of that protocol, all the steps in that protocol, and choose if I want to copy the master steps previously known as process types that are associated with that. So this allows me to quickly and easily make a copy of an entire protocol, rename that protocol as I see fit, and decide the level of depth of that copy that I'm interested in. So if you built a really nice V1 protocol and you want to make a copy of that to start working on for V2, you could simply append the name of this protocol with V2, set it to copy, and be on your way. So not only did the things that we're configuring around a protocol change a little bit, it also changed the way we do steps and master steps. So master steps is a new word. You can think of these as process types. So if you're used to configuring in the operations interface, you have the idea of a process type. But we didn't want to limit you to process type the way it is in configuration now. As you know, if I were to configure a master step or a process type now, I'm limited to things like what are the inputs and outputs, does it have an EPP associated with it, but I can't set any other functionalities or configurations on that. All of those other things like what belongs in my Q view, what's the order of the UDFs on my record detail screen, all of those components were held at the step level. So in the new way of configuration, we wanted to give you the ability to set all of those features and functionalities on the master step so that any number of steps that were derived from it could share that. You could imagine that if you're a 96 well plate lab and you're always going to use a 96 well plate, one thing you might do is configure 96 well plate as a permitted container on all of your master steps. Now, any step that you create to put into a protocol is going to have 96 well plate as a default option. So the next thing that you'll notice is once I've chosen a step or a master step, we have a new way that we've oriented configuration. So one of the things that bothered me the most about the old way of configuration is when you clicked into a protocol, the tabs were never in the right order. So it was like properties and then next steps and record details. They didn't go in the right order. So when we rethought configuration, we wanted to draw a much closer parallel to what you're configuring and how that configuration displays on the screen for the end user. So for example, if I wanted to configure the Q view, I would select the Q view here from the milestones. If I was interested in configuring what containers I wanted to use or whether I'm placing by rows or columns, I would look for those configurations on the placement screen because that's where those configurations are important. So for each step or each master step in the configuration, we have the fundamental things you're used to configuring. What are the outputs of that step? What automations or EPPs are associated with that? As well as things like instrument types or reagent kits. And everywhere that we could, we wanted to include in-app help messaging. So in case you're looking at this screen and you're thinking, oh dear, I've forgotten what reagent kits are. If we take a look right here in the text messaging, we can see what a reagent kit is, where I can add it, and what we're actually going to track when we're looking at this in the step itself. So each one of these things can be configured, and you'll notice that that plus sign is pretty consistent throughout different components. And if I click on that plus sign, what I'm going to notice is that a drawer pops out from the left to show me all of the reagents that I currently have configured in my system. So now I can simply say, okay, I want to select these 3 reagent kits and add them to this master step. So now any step that derives from this, or any time I use this in a protocol, these 3 reagent kits will be asked of the end user to track the particular lot number. So we're providing you flexibility that not only can you configure the reagent like you always have and decide what step it's associated with, we can also make that decision from the step itself so we don't have to jump back and forth between different screens. For each one of these milestones, there's a lot of really exciting things that configuration allows. If we take a look at Ice Bucket, for example, the Ice Bucket screen is going to allow me to have a set of column headers, a set of expanded fields, as well as set the default for am I row versus column and how I want those samples to be grouped. So again, if I'm interested in adding things to my column, I'm simply going to hit the plus button. I'm going to select what type of UDF or custom field that I'm interested in. In this case, I'm interested in submitted sample. And I would like to see the submitted sample name, the date it was submitted, and what type of sample it is. Where I could see all those things at one time. So I can select multiples from that drawer and automatically put those in the screen. Now I can simply, oh, I don't need pooling, I'll get rid of that. Don't need reference genome. So I can easily know exactly what's going to show up in my column header and configure that appropriately. The same holds true for things like record details or placement. But record details has one of my favorite new functionalities. So let's navigate away from this mRNA step, and I'll hit cancel. And I'm going to choose an Illumina sequencing step. And if we take a look at the record details screen on the Illumina sequencing step, you'll notice that I have this ability to configure what steps are, what fields are associated with this step. So think step level UDFs. We'll call them custom fields. And you'll notice here, you may not be able to see it on my screen, depending on your contrast, there's a preview. So previously, when I wanted to order UDFs in a certain way, or I wanted to flip them between horizontal and vertical, the only way for me to really understand what order they were going to show in on the record details screen, I would have to go to that step, I'd have to fake a sample through it, and then I'd have to, run a sample till I got to the record details screen. I'd look at my UDFs, I'd decide what order they should be in, and I'd flip back and forth between configuration and the actual view on the screen. Now, this preview widget is going to allow me to see exactly how those UDFs or custom fields are going to show up on the screen without ever having to leave the configuration screen. So again, giving you context for how this is going to fit inside your actual workflow. So instead of having to go out and fake steps or find a record detail screen to refresh, you can find all that information directly here in configuration so that we're not having to go back and forth as frequently. So not only do we have this lab work tab, you probably noticed this navigation has multiple other tabs. So anything that you're interested in configuring in the LIMS probably has a tab. So if we think about things like consumables, consumables might include reagents, controls, instruments, labels or indexes, as well as containers. So each one of these components has been brought out of the operations interface and has a new home here in the 5.0 configuration. And one of the most exciting components here is what we've done with the idea of indexes or labels. Previously, if you wanted to add an index or a label to your system, you could add them one by one through the operations interface, or you could use a script or config slicer to batch upload them into LIMS. We wanted to make this easier for you, so what we did was we created this interface so that you can actually upload and download these lists in a similar way that you do the sample sheet on the projects and sample screen. So if I wanted to create a new label group, I would create that here and simply upload a properly formatted Excel sheet in order to bring that batch of indexes into my system. So you don't have to find somebody who's got server access in order to run config slicer anymore. You can actually do this yourself directly in the web interface. So we've talked about lab work and consumables. Two of my other favorites before we take a pause for questions are custom fields. So custom fields are things that you typically know as UDFs. So user-defined fields or custom fields come in two flavors. And if you've ever sat in a training session with me, you know I say they come in UDFs on things and UDFs on steps. And that's exactly how this navigation is broken up. So we have what we call global custom fields, which are things like submitted sample, project, derived sample, or analyte, and allows me to see in each section all of the UDFs in one place that are configured on that entity. It's also giving me information about that UDF. So you'll notice there's an icon right next to the name. And these icons give you an idea of what type of UDF that is. So I certainly have the ability to click into any one of these UDFs, but if I just wanted that high-level view, I can quickly and easily see that sequencing method is a text field with a drop-down menu. So in any one of these, if I pick sequencing method, on the right-hand side, I'm going to open up and show exactly the configuration properties that I chose, right? Is it required? Do I allow custom entries? As well as all the drop-down options that I have put in here. So this allows me to see at a quick high level all the UDFs I have configured, as well as give me a broad picture of what type of UDF that is. So there's one thing of interest around a change that we made to a UDF type. So traditionally, and I've used this one on project as an example, traditionally we have a checkbox for configuration. And many of you told us the checkbox was frustrating because you couldn't make a checkbox mandatory. And this was related to the way it was stored at the database, because no is a perfectly acceptable answer to a checkbox. So what we've done is we've reimagined this as a toggle switch. So it still has that same functionality of checking yes or no, but this allows me to, 1, set a default value, and 2, make that a required value. So if we take a look here at our projects and sample screen, I'm going to open a new tab, and I look at the project that I've got configured here. Under the custom fields, I can see how this new toggle switch is going to display. So my toggle switch is called research. You'll notice that no value is currently selected. So if I had made this required, I'm now forcing the user to pick something. So this allows me to have that ability to force a yes or no in a checkbox type setting. So I'll pick yes, and I can save that particular UDF value. So back in configuration, the last thing to talk about before we take a break for some questions and then talk about the upgrade options is around automations. So automations are formally known as EPPs, or external program plugins, and you all know and love these based on the multitudes of ways that they're used inside Clarity. So let's take one that most people know, and let's say generate bioanalyzer driver file. So when I select that automation, I can clearly see what command it's actually running. I can see what the name of it is, just like I always have. But I also have this ability to enable this automation on a master step. And in the old world of the operations interface, I could only enable one master step at a time. So if I wanted to use this same script on another bioanalyzer master step, I would have had to copy it, go to that new master step, and create it there. Now we've created the flexibility to allow you to enable this on multiple steps. So if you wanted to create 4 or 5 bioanalyzer master steps and use this script over multiple times, I can simply select from the drop-down menu and start adding those additional steps. So it's now enabled on multiple master steps without having to do all of those copy and paste functionalities. This has a happy side option here. I had always thought of it as great, I'm not going to have to copy and paste so much, but it also makes the troubleshooting of a script much easier. So you can imagine if I had copied and pasted this script across 5 different steps, as I have here in Assign QC, if I made an error, a spelling error, a spacing error, which I'm prone to, I would have to go back through each one of those EPPs that I created and change it every time. But if I had made a spelling error or some sort of error here, I don't have to go back to every one of those bioanalyzer steps. I've got one central location that the script is being read from. I can simply go back, fix it there, and then hit save. So it keeps me from having to artificially sort of copy all of these steps across the different master steps. But it also allows me to troubleshoot more easily and quickly because I'm not having to go through each one of those and make a change and test it out. So here we're going to take a pause, and I'm going to open up the chat window. So if you can't find the chat window, there at the top of your screen, you'll see the WebEx bar. And in that WebEx bar, you should find the chat box. And if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat box, either while I'm talking or right now while I'm asking for questions. And I will do my best to answer those questions as best I can. All right, no questions as of yet. So let's move on to the second portion of today's discussion. So if we'll take ourselves back to PowerPoint, and we want to talk about here in PowerPoint some of the considerations that you want to think about when you're considering moving to 5.0. So the first thing that I've said a couple of times already, but I want to draw your attention to, is that Clarity LIMS 5.0 will not have the operations interface. So again, many of you did a cheer and some of you made a sad face depending on your feelings about the operations interface. But this puts us in a position to do a whole bunch of exciting things. However, what it means is that in 5.0, there are features and functionalities that you're using in operations that are not going to be supported in the first version of Clarity LIMS 5. So unless I've already talked about an operations interface feature, it is not going to be in 5.0. And some examples of those features that won't be supported in 5.0 are listed here on the screen. We're going to go through some of these in more detail. And you're thinking to yourself, well, Jill, why didn't you bring all of these functionalities and features into 5.0 immediately? And that certainly would have been my choice. But if we had waited to do all of these things at one time, we would have been having this conversation next year sometime. So what we wanted to do was start the process by doing the big thing first, right? Everybody uses configuration. And then work on the next components throughout the remainder of 2017 and into 2018. So when we're talking about 5.0, we want you to understand that there is some discussion about finding the right balance, right? Is 5.0 ready for you or not? So 5.0 doesn't have JBoss, it has no operations interface, as well as the unification of configuration and a bunch of exciting things. And that may be more important to your lab than sample genealogy, for example. But if your lab is critically dependent on one of those operations interface functionalities that's not yet supported, I would suggest that maybe a good idea would be to wait. Right? If you're dependent on use of LabLink, maybe 5.0 is not right for you at this time. And we're going to talk about some of the timelines as we continue through. So in this slide deck, and we won't go through the entire thing, but I'll provide this to you afterwards, is a decision tree to help you walk through each one of those features and functionalities that I mentioned to decide whether is this a critical function for my lab? And if so, should I move to 5.0 or not? So each one of these will allow you to ask yourself important questions. And if we'll take the example of LabLink or the collaborators interface to start with, there at the top you'll see the feature. And that feature will not be supported in 5.0. It will come to the 5.x series. It's just not right now. And underneath that are a few questions and things to consider when evaluating if this is important to you, right? Do you allow external collaborators to submit samples and projects via LabLink? Do you have internal users that use LabLink to either accession samples or manage their projects? The purple box is going to give you the sort of big picture question. Is access to LabLink required? And you have the option to say yes or no. And depending on what you say, you are going to be prompted to go to a different section of this slide deck. So let's, for sake of argument, we'll say no, LabLink is not required for my lab. I'm handling my external collaborators another way, or I'm not actually interested in allowing external access to my system. So by selecting no, I now bring up the next question. So this will walk you through 8 different features and functionalities. So the next one is around sample genealogy and advanced search. And we sort of grouped these in what I would consider the order so that you would say, yes, something is required as quickly as possible. So if you're dependent on LabLink, that's a big thing, right? If sample genealogy or advanced search is important, this is one you need to consider. Now, I will say that sample genealogy and advanced search, if that's something you're using every day, I might consider waiting to go to 5.0. But if it's something that you're only using once or twice a month, maybe that doesn't hold enough value for you to move forward there. The other thing to consider is if you're utilizing our Clarity LIMS reporting module, sample genealogy or advanced search may not be as critically important for your lab as it might be for others. So let's take a look at one more. And this is about tabular data. If you've been around Clarity LIMS a long time, you're familiar with all of the hidden features and functionalities in the operations interface. And one of them that is quite popular is the ability to export data in a tabular form. So this is something that we're considering to bring into the Clarity LIMS web interface, and we're looking at different ways to do this and what makes the most sense in the new interface. But that tabular data where I can, show all of my projects in an Excel-like table and export that to a CSV, that is not yet in Clarity 5. And as it mentions there at the bottom, we're currently brainstorming and gathering requirements about how people are using tabular data today. So if you are interested in, helping me to understand what you're doing and how your lab utilizes this functionality, I would love for you to reach out so that we can have a discussion so that we can take that into consideration while we're building requirements for ongoing functionality. So for any one of these, when I say yes, tabular data access and operations is required for my lab. And that brings us to a discussion about, Clarity LIMS 5.0 is not ready for you, right? We don't want you to lose support for a critical feature in your lab. But we also want you to know that you are more than happy to remain at your Clarity LIMS 4.x system until you determine that a 5.x system is right for you. So while timelines and priorities change all the time, we are working to bring all of those operations features into the Clarity 5 series. So a thing to consider is it may not look exactly the same as it did in operations, but we are bringing sort of the spirit and the fundamental components of all those functionalities into the Clarity Web UI. And if we take a look at a little bit of the roadmap, the next few things that you're going to be seeing coming from the Clarity team are improvements to our out-of-the-box integrations and our pre-configured protocols. We have a continued focus on improvements to security and performance. So while there won't be a dedicated release to performance or a dedicated release to security, all of those components underlie all the work we're doing. How do we make things go faster? How do we make sure that you're secure in the cloud? After that, we'll see compatibility for LabLink or a LabLink type application, improvements to the projects and sample screen, and then later on in the year and first part of 2018, things like sample genealogy, advanced search, and a new set of features around project permissions. So while we may not have the feature or functionality you need right now, that does not mean you're never going to get that functionality in Clarity LIMS 5. So let me back up and say, if you had said no to each one of those features, nope, none of those features are critically important to me, I am really interested in Clarity LIMS 5, and I want to upgrade to it. So we are currently interested in people who want to be first on the upgrade list. Many people they don't want to be the first group, and we totally understand that. But if you're interested in being one of the first groups to upgrade to Clarity LIMS 5, I want you to reach out to your customer success manager or to the support team and let them know that you're interested. This will probably require a discussion to make sure you went through all the decision tree so that you're not going to upgrade. We're not going to upgrade you without being sure you understand the implications. But we're also wanting to make sure that if you're ready to go to 5.0, we want to get you there as soon as possible, because we're all internally looking forward to hearing about how you like the new system, how the new configuration is making your life easier, and all those sorts of components. So I'm going to pause here again for potential questions. See what we've got coming in the chat. So the first question is about upgrade from my current system to 5.0 and what that's going to look like when I upgrade. So the first thing to know is that we have taken this upgrade from 4.0 or from 4.2 to 5.0 quite seriously. And so there is a set of steps, we call them migration steps, that would allow you to not have to reconfigure, not lose your data in order to upgrade from 4.2 to 5.0. That means all of the things you've already configured will automatically be put into the new format with the new naming conventions, with the unified naming conventions, so that you don't have to go back and reconfigure. Now, that reconfiguration is certainly up to you. And there are new functionalities that you might want to leverage once you have 5.0. But your functionalities, your workflows as you have them designed now, will migrate to the new system and will work as you have them currently set up. So the second question is about our API. So for those of you that are doing a lot of scripting in the background, this question always comes up. And so our publicly facing API, we have a relationship and a commitment to you guys doing the API that we're not going to break that publicly facing API when we do a release. And if we were going to break that or create a new version, we would certainly give you notice. But if you're using our public API to create scripts, to run automations in your lab, those will continue to work as designed in Clarity 5.0. Now again, there may be new things in those endpoints or better ways to design those scripts now that we have some new functionality around configuration, but certainly the way that you're already doing it is going to be acceptable and it's going to work exactly as it has designed. So when is this going to release is always an excellent question. So the when here is May of 2017. So that's coming up just around the corner. And this release is going to come with a full set of support components. So documentation, feature videos, as well as new training videos to help you understand, what's new, how it goes with the old way of doing things, as well as new videos for you to give your new people as you onboard. So that allows you to not have to, spend a lot of time training them. You can say, here's this great set of videos, and they can train themselves. So this release will have, all of those things, as well as documentation about the updates of the API, as well as updates of the data model documentation for those of you that are interested in the underlying database structure. All right, so the next question is always about cost. So if you're on support and maintenance and you're using Clarity LIMS right now, this is not an additional cost. So this is something that you can choose to upgrade, or you can choose to wait on a particular feature or functionality that you're interested in, but there's not an additional cost here to move to Clarity LIMS 5.0. So the other question is about how this release affects those other screens. So let me navigate back very quickly to our live demo. And as I mentioned, the configuration upgrades don't necessarily affect the dashboard, the project and samples, or the lab view screens. So each one of those screens is on the list to have a refresh and have new features and functionalities add to it. But at this time, we're focused specifically on that configuration screen. So any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. If not, I'm going to answer some of the common questions here. So the common questions that I normally get are, what happened to, my reagents and controls, right? I'm normally used to seeing it in that black bar down the left-hand side, and I don't see that anymore. So reagents and controls have become part of consumables. And inside consumables, you're going to see 5 tabs across the screen. You're going to see reagents, controls, instruments, labels, and containers. So reagents and controls works exactly the same way it always has. You have the ability to configure a kit, as well as the ability to configure lots inside that kit. And as you know, that permission has traditionally been separate from configuration. So if you have permissions to create lots, you're still going to have permissions to create lots. So the next question that's come in is around Config Slicer. It's everybody's favorite tool to love or hate, depending on your position. And Config Slicer is going to be around in 5.x. So 2 things to say here. The first one is Config Slicer has had some improvements made to it, specifically around the configuration changes that we've made. So we've included things like instruments in the Config Slicer that wasn't there before. And we've documented and tested that a 4.2 configuration slice will import into a 5.0 system without issue. So it allows you to move configuration from maybe a test box that you have laying around to a 5.0 system. Secondly, Config Slicer is also on our roadmap for general improvements. So keep your eye out for more news coming around improvements to Config Slicer, but it's certainly something that we are continuing to use and support and improve upon as we move through the 5.x series. Awesome. So the next question that's come in is around UDFs. So if we take a look at custom fields, the question is around step fields or master step fields. So you'll notice here I've chosen custom fields, and there are 2 sides to this, global fields as well as master step fields. And in my master step fields, I can see all of my master steps that I currently have configured in my system, everything from bioanalyzer to cluster generation to Illumina sequencing. And if I open up any one of these, it's going to look through my system. It's going to see if I have any UDFs. Each one of these allows me to configure UDFs just like I always have. It's going to give me a snapshot of exactly how many UDFs are here. And then once I configure these UDFs, they now become available to me to use in the configuration on the record details screen to present to my end users. So the interaction here really hasn't changed, right? So still the create a UDF associated with a particular step. The configuration of that UDF is quite similar around text fields and numeric fields. And then that ability to choose to display that on the record details is also an option to you. All right, fantastic. So a question that has come up is around supportability of the version that you might already be on. So our support contract says that we support 2 series of Clarity LIMS at a time. So when 5.0 is released, that means we will support Clarity LIMS 4.x series as well as the Clarity LIMS 5.x series. So if you're on either of those 2, you would be fully supported. And in many cases, people say, well, but I'm on 3.5. What does I'm not supported mean? And it means that we're no longer going to do improvements or bug fixes to a version that is not 4x or 5x. That doesn't mean we won't answer your support calls or help you out via email or do a WebEx to help you walk through an issue. But that means from the development perspective, if we fix a particular issue that you're having, the answer might be, yes, we fixed it, but you might have to go to 5.0 to get that fix. So we would not, specifically the question is about the end of support for the 4.x series. And that would not come until we released a Clarity LIMS 6.0. I don't actually have a timeline for that. So I would say at least through the end of 2018. I don't know that we would get to 6.0 by that point, but you certainly would get some warning about 6.0 coming out. All right. So if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to start wrapping up. If you think of something while we're wrapping up, please let me know. So in summary, what we wanted to talk about today was some of the highlights of the new configuration features and functionalities that are coming to 5.0. And I hope from what we've walked through today, you've seen some really exciting stuff that you're interested in that you think will help make your lab more efficient as well as easier to train and use configuration. The second component we talked about was, the limits of 5.0. So 5.0 is fantastic. It brings us no more operations interface, no more JBoss, as well as a unified place to do configuration. But it doesn't have all of the functionalities that you might be dependent on from the operations interface. So we also talked about finding that balance for your lab. And after this session, I'll send out this slide deck as well as a recording of this session so you can walk through each one of those 8 features and decide what's important for your lab versus maybe what's not important and make the decision about, is 5.0 ready for you? If 5.0 is ready for you, please reach out if you're interested in being in the first wave of those in the May-June timeframe to get installed on Clarity 5.0. And finally, we talked a little bit about particulars of the roadmap. So since Clarity LIMS 5 does not include all those components, I wanted you to know that we are looking to bring those components to the web UI, and as well as new features and functionalities. So not just porting over, sample genealogy and advanced search, but we also want to sprinkle in things like improvements to the projects and sample screen, improvements to our pre-configured protocols, and so you get an idea of where we're headed in the 2017 and 2018 timeline. So I want to say thank you for joining us for the webinar today. If you've got questions, please feel free to reach out through support or our CSM, customer success team. You'll get a follow-up email from me about this webinar, including links to the recordings and the link to this slide deck. If you want to get a hold of me personally, if you send an email to support@genealogics.com and you title it Jill, I promise they'll find me. If we don't do it through support, I can't keep up with my Outlook inbox and I might not answer you. At least if there's a ticket created, they're going to keep me honest and make sure that I'm answering everybody that has questions. So thanks so much for joining us. If you've got friends that are interested in this session, keep in mind we're going to do 2 more sessions in next week in later time zones, as well as scheduling 2 more sessions in an earlier time zone for tomorrow. So keep an eye on that news and announcements post in Zendesk, and we'll post a few more of those if you've got colleagues or that want to attend or see one of these sessions live and in person. So have a great day, everybody, and hope you're excited about Clarity LIMS 5.0.